In 30 years investigating homicides, nothing prepared me for the Tommy Collins case. A 10-year-old's final words, "Dad, help." Upstairs, we discovered a torture chamber, surveillance cameras monitoring stress positions for 20 hours daily, systematic abuse spanning years. 3 adults had fooled teachers, social workers, and police for so long. But what haunts me isn't how Tommy died, it's how they managed to hide this level of cruelty in plain sight. Subscribe to the channel, because cases like Tommy's reveal the warning signs that everyone missed, signs that could help you recognize when a child desperately needs help before it's too late. In my 30 years working cases that most people couldn't stomach, I thought I'd seen the worst humanity had to offer. Child abuse cases, domestic violence, murder scenes that would haunt your dreams for months. But what happened on December 13th, 2019 in Dayton, Ohio would shake me to my core in ways I never expected. Sometimes the most disturbing cases don't announce themselves with obvious violence or clear-cut evil. Sometimes they start with a phone call that sounds almost routine, almost normal, almost. It was a Friday evening when 30-year-old David Miller dialed 911. His voice carried that particular blend of panic and confusion that emergency dispatchers hear dozens of times each shift. Nothing about the initial call suggested we were about to uncover something that would make seasoned investigators question everything they thought they knew about human nature. The boy's name was Tommy Collins, just 10 years old. When David called for help that night, claiming his son was unresponsive, the dispatcher followed standard protocol. Basic questions, step-by-step instructions, keeping the caller calm while emergency services raced through the darkening streets of Dayton. But even in those first moments, something felt off. David's responses were erratic, inconsistent. He couldn't seem to keep his story straight about his son's age, stumbling between 11 and 12 before settling on 10. What struck me most when I later listened to that recording was how David described attempting mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. He complained about a putrid smell coming from Tommy's mouth and stomach, something so foul it made him gag. In my experience, that's not something you typically hear from a panicked parent trying to save their child's life. Most parents in crisis are so focused on getting their child breathing again that they wouldn't even notice such details. But David noticed. He noticed enough to comment on it multiple times during the call. The emergency responders who arrived at the modest house on Riverside Drive that night were experienced professionals. They'd seen children in medical distress before, handled countless overdoses, accidents, and family emergencies. Yet what they encountered in that living room made them exchange glances that spoke volumes. Tommy Collins was indeed unresponsive, but the condition of his small body told a story that didn't match his father's frantic explanations. While paramedics worked desperately to revive the boy, loading him into the ambulance with the kind of urgency reserved for the most critical cases, the responding officers began to notice things. Small details that, when pieced together, painted a picture no one wanted to see. The house had an odd smell, not just the typical mustiness of a home that needed cleaning, but something deeper, more concerning. The kind of smell that makes your instincts scream that something is very, very wrong. Tommy was rushed to Dayton Children's Medical Center, where a team of doctors and nurses fought to bring him back. But it was too late. Whatever had happened to this 10-year-old boy in the hours before that 911 call, his small body couldn't recover from it. The time of death was recorded with the clinical precision that medical professionals use to distance themselves from the emotional weight of losing a child. But for the medical staff who tried to save him, there would be no such distance from what they discovered during their examination. The emergency room staff had seen injured children before. They knew the difference between accidental trauma and something more sinister. What they found on Tommy's body sent immediate alerts through the hospital's child protection protocols. The marks, the injuries, the overall condition of this 10-year-old boy painted a picture that made even experienced pediatric nurses struggle to maintain their professional composure. Within hours, what had started as a medical emergency had transformed into something much darker. The officers who had responded to that initial 911 call found themselves returning to the house on Riverside Drive, but this time with a different purpose. They weren't there to provide assistance to a grieving family. They were there to investigate a potential homicide. David Miller's demeanor during those first crucial hours after his son's death would become a central focus of the investigation. While most parents in such circumstances are consumed by grief, shock, or desperate hope that medical professionals might still save their child, David seemed oddly detached. When officers informed him that Tommy had died, his reaction was not what seasoned investigators expected from a father who had just lost his son. The house itself began to reveal secrets that David had hoped would remain hidden. What he had described to the 911 dispatcher as a normal family home was anything but normal. The living conditions, particularly in the areas where Tommy spent his time, were disturbing enough to make officers document everything with the kind of methodical care reserved for crime scenes. But perhaps most unsettling was David's insistence on providing explanations before anyone had even asked for them. He seemed desperate to frame the narrative, to control how others understood Tommy's condition and the circumstances of his death. In my experience, innocent parents in crisis don't typically feel the need to justify or explain their child's injuries before investigators have even begun asking questions. The decision to bring David in for questioning wasn't made lightly. When someone loses a child, law enforcement tries to balance the need for investigation with respect for the family's grief. But the evidence was mounting too quickly to ignore. The medical examiner's preliminary findings, combined with the officer's observations at the house, painted a picture that demanded immediate attention. What happened in the police station that evening would provide investigators with insights into David's mental state and his relationship with his son, but it would also reveal the depth of deception and the horrifying reality of what Tommy's daily life had been like in the months leading up to his death. Before the formal interview could begin, David had what officers described as an emotional outburst. Alone in an interview room, he grabbed a chair and began using it to pound against the door and walls with such force that officers outside could hear the impacts echoing through the station. When they entered to subdue him, David's resistance required physical force to bring under control. The man who had seemed oddly calm about his son's death was now exhibiting the kind of violent behavior that made investigators wonder what else he might be capable of. As David sat in handcuffs, claiming he'd been injured during the altercation, the detective assigned to the case prepared to uncover the truth about Tommy Collins' short life and tragic death. What they were about to discover would challenge everything they thought they knew about family dynamics, child protection, and the depths of human cruelty. The detective's opening words to David were carefully chosen. And this wasn't just a conversation about a medical emergency gone wrong. This was a homicide investigation. And David Miller was about to learn that his carefully constructed explanations were about to be tested against forensic evidence, witness statements, and the cold, hard facts that dead children's bodies reveal to those trained to read their silent testimony. But what the detective didn't yet know was that David wasn't the only adult in that house who had knowledge of Tommy's suffering. There were others, and their stories would soon add layers of complexity and horror to a case that was already defying belief. The house on Riverside Drive had harbored secrets that went far beyond one man's relationship with his son. As David finally agreed to waive his rights and speak with investigators, the first thing he chose to address were the marks covering Tommy's body. His explanation would be the beginning of a narrative so disturbing, so far removed from normal parent-child relationships, that even experienced homicide detectives would struggle to process what they were hearing. And this was just the beginning. What David revealed about Tommy's living conditions, his daily treatment, and the other adults who witnessed it all would prove that sometimes the most horrific crimes happen not in dark alleys or abandoned buildings, but in suburban homes where neighbors pass by every day, never suspecting the hell that exists just beyond those ordinary-looking walls. The truth about Tommy Collins was about to emerge, and it would change everyone who heard it. As David's interrogation continued, investigators knew they needed to hear from the other adults who lived in that house. Lisa Henderson, David's girlfriend and the homeowner, was brought in for questioning. At 30 years old, Lisa had been in a relationship with David for several years, and according to records, she was present during much of Tommy's time in their home. But her version of events would prove to be just as troubling as David's, albeit in entirely different ways. When detectives first approached Lisa about speaking with them, her primary concern wasn't about Tommy's death or the circumstances surrounding it. Instead, she immediately asked about her sister, 27-year-old Sarah Walsh, who was also being questioned separately. Lisa explained that Sarah had bipolar disorder, ADHD, depression, and learning disabilities that affected her communication abilities. The picture that emerged was of a household with multiple adults, each with their own challenges, all living under one roof with two children, Tommy and David's 3-year-old brother. Lisa's account of Tommy's life in their home was markedly different from David's, but not in the way investigators might have hoped, where David painted Tommy as a violent, uncontrollable child who required constant supervision and physical restraint. Lisa presented a more complex narrative that somehow managed to be even more disturbing in its casual acceptance of what was clearly abuse. She told detectives that Tommy was a good kid when David first gained custody of him after years of fighting through the Wisconsin court system. According to Lisa, Tommy had bounced between foster homes before finally being placed with David, and initially the adjustment seemed to go well. They moved to Dayton in 2014, and Tommy was enrolled at Franklin Elementary School, where Lisa claimed he began exhibiting behavioral problems. But it was Lisa's description of Tommy's living situation that made investigators' blood run cold. She confirmed that Tommy spent most of his time in the upstairs area of the house, specifically in what she euphemistically referred to as his room. When pressed for details about this space, Lisa's answers became evasive and contradictory in ways that immediately raised red flags. The upstairs area that Lisa and David both referred to was actually the house's attic space. When investigators had first entered the home after Tommy's death, they had been drawn to this area by a smell that was unmistakable to anyone who had worked crime scenes involving prolonged human suffering. What they found there would haunt them for years to come. The space was barely large enough for a child to stand upright. There were no working lights, leaving Tommy in near constant darkness when he was confined there. The floor was covered with a large plastic tarp, the kind used for construction projects or to cover outdoor equipment. On this tarp sat a yellow plastic stool with two of its four legs broken off, making it unstable and uncomfortable to sit on for any length of time. The smell that had first alerted officers was the result of human waste that had accumulated over what appeared to be months, possibly longer. There was a bucket in the corner that had obviously been used as a makeshift toilet, but the evidence suggested that Tommy had been forced to relieve himself wherever he was when the need arose. The walls showed dark stains that testing would later confirm were human blood, and both a shower curtain and additional plastic sheeting bore evidence of prolonged exposure to bodily waste. Perhaps most heartbreaking was what investigators determined had served as Tommy's bed, a green cot that resembled a camping chair or lawn furniture. This was where a 10-year-old boy had been expected to sleep, night after night, in a space that no reasonable person would consider fit for human habitation, let alone a child. When confronted with the conditions investigators had found in the attic, both David and Lisa offered explanations that defied logic and basic human decency. David claimed that Tommy preferred to be upstairs, that it was his choice to spend time there. Lisa's explanations were even more convoluted, involving claims about the roof leaking and the area being off-limits, while simultaneously acknowledging that Tommy spent significant time there. Their attempts to explain the presence of urine and feces in the space were particularly telling. Lisa initially claimed that the family's dogs sometimes went upstairs, and that's why there were waste materials present. When investigators pointed out that there were no dogs in the house, and that the evidence clearly indicated human waste, Lisa's story changed. She then suggested that Tommy had been trained to use buckets for bathroom needs, though investigators had found only one bucket, and the evidence showed waste scattered throughout the space. The contradictions between David and Lisa's accounts were numerous and significant. While David claimed to have been homeschooling Tommy for the past 2 years due to behavioral problems and school suspensions, Lisa told a different story about who was supposedly providing this education. Neither of their explanations aligned with what investigators would later learn from Tommy's former school. What made the living situation even more disturbing was the clear evidence that this arrangement had been deliberate and sustained. Throughout the house, investigators found family photos showing David, Lisa, Sarah, and David's younger brother in various combinations. They were typical family photos, birthday parties, holidays, everyday moments that families choose to capture and preserve. But in none of these images was Tommy present. It was as if he had been systematically erased from the family's documented history, existing only in the shadows of their lives. The school's perspective on Tommy would prove to be, perhaps, the most damning evidence against David's characterization of his son. When investigators contacted Franklin Elementary School, they spoke with Tommy's teachers, the principal, and the school nurse, all of whom painted a picture of a child that bore no resemblance to the violent, manipulative boy David described. Tommy's principal was unequivocal in her assessment. She had no recollection of any significant behavioral problems. Tommy was described as a well-rounded student, friendly and helpful, someone who wanted to please people and would volunteer to help whenever possible. His teachers echoed this sentiment, describing a boy who was emotional and sensitive, but never violent or aggressive in the ways David claimed. One teacher's description was particularly poignant. Tommy would often separate himself from other students and adults, standing alone and crying. He was described as getting down on himself and being really sad, crying frequently, but never showing the violent tendencies David attributed to him. Instead, Tommy was remembered as one of the sweetest children, someone who loved to make people laugh and was generally happy-go-lucky despite his obvious emotional struggles. The school nurse's observations added another layer to the tragic picture. She remembered Tommy as being very thin and always hungry. The breakfast staff would give him extra food because his need was so obvious. Most tellingly, the school had taken to washing Tommy's clothes because he consistently arrived at school with a strong smell of urine. They would have him change into clean clothes while they laundered what he had worn to school, then send him home in his original clothes at the end of the day. This detail was particularly significant because it showed that Tommy's condition was so noticeable that school staff felt compelled to intervene on a regular basis. The fact that a 10-year-old boy was coming to school smelling of urine with such consistency that staff had developed a routine for dealing with it spoke to conditions at home that were far worse than anything David or Lisa had admitted to. The school nurse also revealed that David had been upset about the school's efforts to help Tommy. He had specifically objected to them washing Tommy's clothes and had expressed anger about what he perceived as excessive attention being paid to his son's condition. This reaction was telling most parents would be grateful for school staff going above and beyond to help their child feel comfortable and clean. David's objection suggested that he saw the school's intervention as unwelcome scrutiny. The principal's account of Tommy's withdrawal from school was equally revealing. Contrary to David's claims about behavioral problems and suspensions, Tommy had been withdrawn abruptly after school staff contacted Child Protective Services about their concerns. The principal recalled David coming to the school angry and defensive, telling them he was tired of them questioning his son and that he was withdrawing Tommy because of their reports to authorities. This pattern of David removing Tommy from situations where outside adults might observe his condition would become a central theme in the investigation. It appeared that whenever questions were raised about Tommy's welfare, David's response was to further isolate the boy rather than address the underlying concerns. The school's multiple reports to Child Protective Services painted a picture of a system that had failed Tommy repeatedly. Despite clear indicators that he was suffering neglect and possibly abuse, these reports appeared to have resulted in no meaningful intervention. Tommy remained in David's custody, and when the scrutiny became too intense, David simply removed him from school entirely, claiming to homeschool him, but actually isolating him further from potential advocates or witnesses to his condition. As investigators delved deeper into David's claims about homeschooling, the facade became increasingly transparent. Neither David nor Lisa could provide evidence of any structured educational program. There were no lesson plans, no records of Tommy's progress, no indication that any meaningful learning was taking place. David's vague references to printing materials from the library and having Sarah assist with instruction fell apart under questioning when it became clear that Sarah's own cognitive limitations would have made her unable to provide appropriate education for a 10-year-old. The reality was that Tommy had been effectively imprisoned in that house for 2 years, cut off from teachers, school counselors, classmates, and any other adults who might have questioned his treatment or advocated for his welfare. The decision to homeschool him appeared to be nothing more than a strategy to prevent outside observation of his deteriorating condition. But the most disturbing revelations were yet to come. As David's interrogation continued into the early morning hours, his account of the events leading up to Tommy's death would reveal a level of cruelty and neglect that challenged investigators' ability to maintain their professional composure. The details he was about to share would make it clear that Tommy's death was not the result of a sudden incident, but rather the inevitable conclusion of months or possibly years of systematic torture. David's description of Tommy's final day would expose the true nature of what had been happening in that house, and investigators would soon understand that the conditions they had discovered in the attic were not the worst of what Tommy had endured. The physical evidence was damning enough, but David's own words were about to reveal the psychological torture that had accompanied the physical abuse. As David began to describe what he claimed were Tommy's actions on the morning of his death, it became clear that he was attempting to justify the unjustifiable. His explanations were not those of a grieving father trying to understand how his son had died. They were the calculated words of someone trying to shift blame, to paint Tommy as somehow responsible for his own suffering and death. The investigators listening to David's account would soon realize that they were not just dealing with a case of child abuse that had escalated to murder. They were confronting something far more disturbing, a systematic campaign of dehumanization that had reduced a 10-year-old boy to something less than human in the eyes of the adults who were supposed to protect him. And David's willingness to share these details suggested that he genuinely believed his treatment of Tommy was justified, that somehow this child had deserved what had been done to him. What David was about to reveal would force investigators to confront the darkest aspects of human nature, and would leave them wondering how many other children might be suffering in similar silence, hidden away from the world by adults who had convinced themselves that their cruelty was somehow justified or necessary. As David's interrogation moved into its most disturbing phase, the detectives found themselves confronting details that challenged their professional training and emotional resilience. What David was about to describe as the events of Tommy's final morning would reveal the true extent of the horror that had been Tommy's daily reality for months, possibly years. David's account began with what he claimed was routine surveillance of Tommy through a camera system he had installed in the attic space. According to David, he regularly monitored Tommy's activities from downstairs, watching him through this electronic eye that had turned the boy's confined living space into something resembling a prison cell under constant observation. This detail alone was deeply unsettling. The idea that a 10-year-old child was being watched continuously, never allowed privacy or the basic dignity of being unsupervised even in his most vulnerable moments. What David described seeing on that camera feed that morning was so disturbing that even hardened investigators struggled to process it. He claimed to have witnessed Tommy engaging in self-harm so severe that it resulted in significant physical trauma. David's clinical, almost detached description of these events was perhaps as chilling as the events themselves. He spoke about his son's suffering with the emotional distance of someone describing a broken appliance, not a child in crisis. According to David, when he went upstairs to intervene, Tommy had inflicted serious internal injuries upon himself. David's description of trying to remove foreign objects from Tommy's body, the blood that resulted, and his decision to place the injured child in the bathtub, painted a picture of medical emergency that any reasonable parent would have immediately recognized as requiring emergency intervention. Yet David claimed he examined Tommy's injuries himself and determined they weren't serious enough to warrant immediate medical attention. This decision to assess serious internal injuries to a child without medical training and to delay seeking help revealed David's complete disregard for Tommy's welfare. The fact that he could look at a bleeding, injured 10-year-old and decide the situation wasn't urgent enough for emergency care spoke to a mindset that had completely dehumanized this child. David's timeline of events that morning was equally disturbing. After the initial incident and his crude attempt at medical assessment, he claimed to have sent Tommy back upstairs to the attic space rather than keeping him close for monitoring or seeking medical attention. It was from this upstairs prison that Tommy would call out for help for the final time. The image David painted of Tommy's last conscious moments was heartbreaking. A 10-year-old boy, injured and alone in a dark, fetid space, calling out, "Dad, help," to the man who had systematically tortured him. David's response to this plea for help was to wait several minutes before investigating. And even then, his concern seemed to be determining whether Tommy was playing around rather than genuinely in distress. When David finally went upstairs, he found Tommy with fluid coming from his mouth, struggling to communicate. Yet even in describing these obviously critical symptoms, David seemed more annoyed than concerned. His characterization of Tommy's condition as a freak show and his references to Tommy's normal thing revealed how completely he had normalized his son's suffering. The details about Tommy's state of undress added another layer of degradation to the situation. When asked about Tommy's clothing, David revealed that the boy had been naked, and his explanation for this condition was that giving Tommy clothes was pointless because he would spoil them right away. This casual admission revealed that Tommy had been regularly forced to remain unclothed, adding humiliation to his physical suffering. Lisa's corroborating account of the clothing situation was equally damning. When investigators asked her about what Tommy wore, she explained that while he had initially possessed normal children's clothing jeans, khaki pants, and t-shirts, she had been forced to throw out 99% of these items. Her claim that only toddler-sized clothing remained for a 10-year-old boy suggested either deliberate deprivation or such severe neglect that Tommy's basic needs for appropriate clothing had been ignored entirely. This detail became even more significant when investigators completed their thorough search of the house and found no clothing that would have fit Tommy. The implication was clear. This child had been systematically deprived of even the most basic dignity of appropriate clothing, forced to remain naked or inadequately clothed as part of his ongoing humiliation and dehumanization. David's behavior during the interrogation also revealed his mindset. Rather than expressing grief, shock, or concern about Tommy's death, his primary worry seemed to be whether he would be the only one charged with crimes. His question to detectives about whether anyone else would face charges suggested that he was well aware that others in the household had knowledge of Tommy's treatment and that criminal behavior had occurred. His claim that no one else had been home during Tommy's final crisis was immediately contradicted by other evidence. Lisa and her sister Sarah had indeed been away from the house, but their absence appeared to have been deliberately timed. Lisa's account of her afternoon errands, rushing to get to the bank before it closed, making multiple stops, including one at a pharmacy, suggested an urgency that was inconsistent with routine shopping. The detail about the pharmacy visit would prove particularly significant as investigators dug deeper into the timeline of events. Lisa's mention of stopping at a drugstore, combined with her obvious rush to complete errands and return home quickly, raised questions about whether she had advanced knowledge that something serious was going to happen to Tommy that day. But it was Sarah's testimony that would finally lift the veil on the true extent of Tommy's suffering. Sarah, with her cognitive limitations and communication difficulties, had been living in the house throughout the period of Tommy's abuse. Unlike David and Lisa, who had crafted carefully constructed narratives to minimize their culpability, Sarah's account was raw, unfiltered, and devastating in its honesty. Sarah's emotional state during her interview was markedly different from the calculated composure displayed by David and Lisa. Where they had been defensive and evasive, Sarah was clearly distressed and frightened. Her opening statements revealed that she had been explicitly warned by Lisa that if anything happened, we're all going down. This threat had clearly been weighing on Sarah's mind, and she had made a decision to tell the truth rather than risk being held responsible for crimes she had witnessed but not committed. What Sarah revealed about Tommy's daily life was beyond what even experienced investigators had imagined. Her description of the systematic escalation of abuse painted a picture of a child who had been subjected to increasingly severe torture over an extended period. What had begun as traditional corporal punishment, spanking, and corner time had evolved into something that could only be described as sadistic torture. Sarah's account of the physical violence Tommy endured was almost too horrible to process. She described watching David punch, kick, and elbow Tommy repeatedly. She spoke of Tommy being struck across the head with such force that it would have been obvious to any observer that serious injury was likely. But perhaps most disturbing was her revelation about the introduction of weapons into Tommy's abuse. The use of electrical devices to inflict pain on a 10-year-old child represented a level of premeditation and cruelty that transformed this from a case of escalating domestic violence into something approaching organized torture. Sarah's description of David using these devices on Tommy while she watched helplessly revealed the calculated nature of the abuse and the terror that had pervaded the household. The metal implement Sarah described being used to beat Tommy added another dimension to the systematic nature of his abuse. This wasn't the result of momentary anger or loss of control. It was the deliberate selection and use of tools designed to inflict maximum pain and injury on a child's body. Sarah's revelation about the camera system added a sinister element to the surveillance aspect of Tommy's captivity. The fact that this electronic monitoring had been dismantled before authorities arrived suggested advanced planning and an awareness of guilt. David's explanation that the camera system was unreliable and only worked sometimes rang hollow when weighed against Sarah's testimony about the systematic monitoring of Tommy's every move. The timing of the camera's disconnection was particularly significant. If, as David claimed, he regularly monitored Tommy through this system, why would it suddenly malfunction on the day of Tommy's death? The fact that investigators found the camera equipment dismantled and discarded in the attic space suggested deliberate tampering rather than technical failure. This evidence of surveillance also raised disturbing questions about the other adults in the household. If David was regularly monitoring Tommy through cameras, and if the abuse Sarah described was as regular and severe as she indicated, how could Lisa and Sarah claim ignorance of what was happening? The camera system suggested that Tommy's suffering was not only known to the adults in the house, but was actively observed and recorded. Sarah's emotional breakdown during her testimony revealed the psychological toll that witnessing Tommy's abuse had taken on her. Despite her cognitive limitations, she clearly understood that what she had witnessed was wrong, and that her failure to stop it weighed heavily on her conscience. Her decision to finally speak the truth came not from any legal strategy, but from a genuine desire to ensure that Tommy's suffering was acknowledged and that those responsible were held accountable. The picture that emerged from Sarah's testimony was of a household where Tommy's torture had become normalized, where his screams and pleas for help had become background noise that the adults had learned to ignore. Her description of the escalating violence suggested that David's abuse of Tommy had become increasingly sadistic over time, as if each previous level of cruelty had lost its impact and required escalation to satisfy some twisted need for control and dominance. Perhaps most heartbreaking was Sarah's implicit acknowledgement that she had been powerless to help Tommy despite witnessing his suffering daily. Her cognitive limitations, her dependence on Lisa for housing and support, and the clear threats that had been made about the consequences of speaking out had created a situation where Tommy's only potential advocate within the household had been effectively silenced. The contrast between Sarah's obvious distress about Tommy's fate and the calculated responses of David and Lisa was stark. While David focused on minimizing his legal exposure and Lisa concerned herself with protecting her sister and maintaining her version of events, Sarah was genuinely grieving for a little boy whose torture she had been forced to witness but had been unable to stop. As investigators processed Sarah's testimony, they realized they were dealing with something far more complex than a single instance of child abuse that had resulted in death. This was a systematic campaign of torture that had been conducted over months or years, witnessed by multiple adults and hidden from the outside world through deliberate isolation and deception. The evidence was mounting that Tommy's death was not the result of a single day's events, but rather the inevitable conclusion of sustained torture that had finally pushed his small body beyond its ability to survive. The adults in that house had not just failed to protect him, they had actively participated in or enabled his destruction, and then had attempted to cover their tracks when their cruelty finally achieved its logical conclusion. What investigators still didn't fully understand was the motivation behind Tommy's systematic torture. Was this the result of mental illness, sadistic personality disorders, or something even darker? And how had three adults managed to maintain this level of coordinated deception while slowly torturing a child to death in their midst? The answers to these questions would emerge as the investigation continued. But what was already clear was that Tommy Collins had lived the final years of his life in a hell that most people couldn't imagine, surrounded by adults who had not only failed to protect him, but had actively participated in his destruction. His death was not a tragedy in the traditional sense. It was a murder carried out slowly, methodically, and with the full knowledge and participation of everyone who should have been keeping him safe. As the investigation deepened, detectives uncovered a pattern of systematic failure that had allowed Tommy's torture to continue for years, despite multiple warnings, reports, and desperate pleas for intervention. What emerged was not just the story of one family's descent into unthinkable cruelty, but a damning indictment of a system that had repeatedly failed to protect a child whose suffering was documented, reported, and witnessed by numerous professionals and family members. The surveillance system that David had installed in the attic revealed the calculated nature of Tommy's imprisonment. Sarah's testimony about the cameras provided crucial insight into how Tommy's captivity had been managed and monitored. According to her account, the cameras were positioned to provide live surveillance of Tommy's every movement, but the feed was not recorded. This detail was significant because it suggested that while David wanted to monitor Tommy constantly, he was careful not to create permanent evidence of what was happening in that space. The implications of this surveillance system were staggering. Tommy had been living under constant electronic observation, denied even the basic privacy that every human being deserves. His most vulnerable moments, his pain, his fear, his desperate attempts to cope with his circumstances, all of it, had been watched and monitored by the man who was systematically destroying him. The psychological impact of such constant surveillance on a child who was already being subjected to physical torture was almost impossible to calculate. David's complaints about the burden of dealing with Tommy revealed a mindset that had completely inverted the parent-child relationship. Rather than seeing himself as responsible for Tommy's welfare, David portrayed himself as the victim of Tommy's existence. His claims about contacting social services 40 or 50 times, seeking help with what he characterized as Tommy's behavioral problems, painted a picture of a man who viewed his son as a problem to be solved, rather than a child to be protected and nurtured. The truth about David's interactions with authorities was far more complex and disturbing than his self-serving narrative suggested. Records showed that he had indeed contacted police for assistance with Tommy, but the nature of these contacts revealed David's true motivations. Rather than seeking help for a child in crisis, David was attempting to use law enforcement as a tool to further control and intimidate Tommy. The incident from November 2018 was particularly revealing. David had called police claiming that Tommy was being unruly and expressing a desire for officers to take the boy to a juvenile detention center. When officers arrived, they found Tommy injured from what was described as a fall from the attic window, an incident that, in hindsight, raised serious questions about whether this had been an accident or the result of Tommy's desperate attempt to escape his circumstances. The image of a 10-year-old boy being placed in handcuffs and put in the back of a police cruiser was deeply troubling, but what was even more disturbing was what the officers failed to do. They noted that Tommy was limping from his injuries, but didn't question why a child who had been hospitalized for a serious fall was no longer in a cast. David's explanation that Tommy had cut it off should have raised immediate red flags about the level of supervision and care the boy was receiving. Most significantly, the officers never entered the home to assess Tommy's living conditions, never spoke with him privately to get his version of events, and never questioned the appropriateness of a father calling police to have his injured 10-year-old son arrested. They simply left Tommy in David's custody, effectively validating David's portrayal of his son as a behavioral problem rather than recognizing him as a potential victim. But perhaps the most heartbreaking failure of the system was revealed in the desperate attempts by Tommy's biological mother, Rachel, to save her son. 7 months before Tommy's death, Rachel had made a frantic call to police, begging them to conduct a welfare check on her son. Her call revealed that she had been monitoring the situation from a distance and had become increasingly alarmed by what she was learning about Tommy's treatment. Rachel's call to police was the plea of a mother who had been cut off from her child, but was still fighting to protect him. She told officers that she believed David was abusing Tommy, and that the boy was too frightened to speak out because of David's control over his life. Her specific mention of David pulling Tommy out of school was particularly significant because it showed that she understood the isolation tactics being used to hide the abuse. The details Rachel provided to police painted a picture of systematic abuse that should have triggered immediate intervention. She spoke of Tommy being locked in his room, of him trying to escape through a window, of being sent to school in inappropriate clothing, and of being subjected to violent discipline with implements. Her description of David's threatening behavior toward Tommy, including promises to abandon him at a group home, revealed the psychological terror that accompanied the physical abuse. Rachel's request that officers speak with Tommy privately, away from David's intimidating presence, showed that she understood the dynamics of abuse and the likelihood that Tommy would be too frightened to speak honestly in front of his abuser. This was a reasonable and standard request in child welfare investigations, and one that should have been honored given the serious nature of the allegations. Yet when officers responded to Rachel's call, they conducted what can only be described as a perfunctory investigation. They spoke with David through a screen door, never entered the home to assess Tommy's living conditions, and when they brought Tommy to the door, they failed to separate him from David for a private conversation, despite Rachel's specific request that they do so. The officer's report noted that Tommy appeared properly dressed and was soft-spoken and polite, answering questions with "yes, ma'am" and "no, ma'am." To these officers, Tommy's demeanor suggested he was fine, but to anyone familiar with abuse dynamics, his behavior was a textbook example of a traumatized child who had been trained to present well to authority figures. His extreme politeness and reluctance to speak were classic signs of a child living in fear, not indicators of a healthy, well-adjusted boy. The failure to conduct a proper investigation in response to Rachel's call represented a missed opportunity that might have saved Tommy's life. Instead, the police left him in David's custody with their implicit endorsement of David's parenting, effectively telling him that the outside world would not help him no matter how desperate his situation became. As detectives continued their interrogation of David, they pressed him for more details about his claims regarding Tommy's behavior on the morning of his death. David's description of what he claimed to have seen on the surveillance camera was so disturbing that investigators struggled to process it. He alleged that Tommy had been using a broken piece of furniture to inflict severe internal injuries upon himself, describing this with the clinical detachment of someone discussing a mechanical problem rather than a child suffering. The broken stool that had become central to David's narrative was a piece of yellow plastic furniture that had lost 2 of its forelegs, making it unstable and uncomfortable to sit on. David's claim that Tommy had been using pieces of this broken furniture to harm himself was not only medically implausible, but revealed David's desperation to construct a narrative that would absolve him of responsibility for Tommy's condition. Sarah's testimony about this same piece of furniture told a very different story. According to her account, the broken stool had been deliberately modified and used as an instrument of torture, with Tommy being forced to sit on it in uncomfortable positions for extended periods as punishment. Her description of Tommy being made to maintain stress, positioned standing with legs crossed and hands behind his head, revealed that David had been employing techniques typically associated with military interrogation or prisoner abuse. The location where investigators found the broken pieces of the stool was also significant. One piece had been hidden behind the television in the living room, while another was found in a laundry basket outside the bathroom. The fact that these items had been deliberately concealed suggested advanced planning and an awareness that they would be viewed as evidence of wrongdoing. David's description of the events of Tommy's final morning continued to evolve and contradict itself as the interrogation progressed. His timeline, his explanations for his actions, and his characterizations of Tommy's condition all shifted in ways that suggested he was constructing his narrative in real time rather than recounting actual events. But it was Sarah's account of that morning that finally revealed the truth about Tommy's final hours. Her version of events was markedly different from both David's and Lisa's accounts, and her obvious distress while recounting these details lent credibility to her testimony in ways that the calculated responses of the other adults did not. According to Sarah, Tommy's final day had begun with him stumbling as he came downstairs for breakfast, suggesting that he was already in serious physical distress before the events David described had taken place. Sarah's description of David's violent response to Tommy's condition, attacking him while he was in the bathroom, threatening to drown him in the bathtub, and then subjecting him to additional physical abuse, painted a picture of escalating violence that culminated in Tommy's death. The detail about Tommy appearing to be drowning while David allegedly cleaned him in the bathtub was particularly chilling. Sarah's description of hearing splashing sounds while David threatened Tommy revealed that what David characterized as medical care was actually a continuation of the abuse that had been Tommy's daily reality. Sarah's account of David forcing Tommy into stress positions, stepping on him while he was prone, and then subjecting him to additional abuse while he lay on his side provided a timeline of torture that explained Tommy's rapid deterioration throughout the morning. Her testimony made it clear that Tommy's death was not the result of a single incident, but rather the cumulative effect of sustained abuse that had finally pushed his small body beyond its ability to survive. Perhaps most significantly, Sarah revealed that she had been awakened by Lisa crying and freaking out about Tommy's condition, which suggested that Lisa had been present during at least part of the morning's events and was aware that something serious had happened before the decision was made to leave the house. This detail about Lisa's emotional state contradicted her own account of the morning's events and raised serious questions about the timing of her departure from the house. The fact that both Lisa and Sarah had left the house after becoming aware that Tommy was in serious distress, but before emergency services were called, suggested a level of coordination and advanced planning that was deeply disturbing. The revelation that Lisa and Sarah's trip to the pharmacy had been prompted by Tommy's condition added another layer to the potential conspiracy surrounding his death. The specific mention of Walgreens in Lisa's account of their errands raised questions about what they might have been seeking to purchase, and whether their departure from the house had been timed to avoid being present when Tommy's condition became critical. As investigators pieced together the various accounts of Tommy's final day, they realized they were dealing not just with a case of child abuse that had resulted in death, but with evidence of premeditation, coordination, and attempted cover-up among the adults who should have been protecting him. The contradictions between the various accounts, the evidence of concealment and destruction, and the timing of the adults' actions all pointed to a level of planning that transformed this from a tragic case of abuse escalation into something approaching premeditated murder. The question that haunted investigators was how 3 adults could have participated in or witnessed the systematic torture of a 10-year-old child over a period of months or years without intervention from outside authorities, despite multiple reports and warnings. The answer lay in a perfect storm of systemic failures, deliberate deception, and the isolation tactics that had effectively cut Tommy off from anyone who might have helped him. Tommy Collins had died not just from the physical abuse he suffered on his final day, but from the accumulated trauma of living in a hell that had been carefully constructed and maintained by the adults who controlled every aspect of his life. His death was the inevitable conclusion of a campaign of torture that had been allowed to continue despite numerous opportunities for intervention. As the investigation continued, detectives knew they were racing against time to build a case that would hold all responsible parties accountable for their roles in Tommy's death. But they also knew that no amount of justice could undo the suffering that Tommy had endured or restore the childhood that had been stolen from him by the very people who should have cherished and protected him. The evidence was mounting. The contradictions in the suspects' stories were becoming impossible to ignore, and the truth about what had happened in that house of horrors was finally beginning to emerge. But what investigators still didn't fully understand was the motivation behind such systematic cruelty, and whether there were other children who might still be suffering in similar circumstances while the system continued to fail them as it had failed Tommy. As the investigation reached its most crucial phase, detectives began to unravel the complex web of deception that the adults in Tommy's life had constructed around his systematic torture. What emerged was not just evidence of horrific abuse, but proof of a coordinated effort to conceal, justify, and continue that abuse even as it escalated toward its inevitable tragic conclusion. Sarah's revelation about Lisa's consultation with a friend at the pharmacy added a chilling dimension to the timeline of Tommy's final day. According to Sarah, Lisa had sought advice from this friend about what to do regarding Tommy's condition, though she had been deliberately vague about the specifics of the situation. The friend's advice, "Don't run because it would look bad," suggested that even without knowing the full extent of what was happening, this person understood that Lisa was in a situation that could have serious legal consequences. This detail was significant because it demonstrated that Lisa had been aware something serious was happening to Tommy and had been seeking outside counsel about how to handle the situation. Her decision to consult with someone outside the household suggested that she understood the gravity of Tommy's condition, contradicting her later claims of ignorance about his injuries and suffering. Even more damning was Sarah's revelation that Lisa had been the one to instruct David to call 911 after realizing that Tommy wasn't breathing. This completely undermined Lisa's carefully constructed narrative of innocence and ignorance. If she had been unaware of Tommy's condition and had left the house for routine errands, how could she have been present to assess his breathing and direct David's response? The contradictions in Lisa's story were becoming impossible to ignore. She had claimed to be absent from the house during the critical period of Tommy's deterioration, yet Sarah's testimony placed her at the scene during crucial moments. Her decision to leave the house with Sarah after becoming aware of Tommy's distress, but before emergency services were called, suggested a level of coordination and planning that was deeply troubling. When confronted by investigators about the extensive injuries covering Tommy's body, Lisa's denials became increasingly implausible. Her claims that she had never noticed the marks, cuts, and obvious signs of abuse on a 10-year-old boy she lived with and allegedly helped care for stretched credibility beyond the breaking point. Her statement that she didn't like looking at his body and had no idea about his injuries painted a picture of willful blindness that was almost as disturbing as active participation in his abuse. The investigators' frustration with Lisa's evasions was evident in their direct confrontation of her obvious deceptions, their blunt assessment that she was not stupid, and their refusal to accept. Her claims of ignorance reflected their understanding that Lisa's denials were calculated rather than genuine. The evidence of Tommy's suffering was too extensive, too obvious, and too sustained for any adult living in that house to have been unaware of it. Sarah's continued revelations about Tommy's daily existence painted an even darker picture of his captivity. Her confirmation that Tommy was regularly locked in the attic space, only allowed to leave for bathroom breaks, revealed the prison-like conditions of his daily life. But what she was about to reveal would add an even more horrific dimension to Tommy's suffering. The bathroom arrangements for Tommy represented another level of dehumanization that was almost impossible to process. Sarah's reluctant admission that Tommy was severely limited in his access to bathroom facilities helped explain some of the most disturbing aspects of the physical evidence investigators had found in the attic space. The systematic denial of basic human dignity through restricted bathroom access was a form of torture that spoke to the calculated nature of Tommy's abuse. But perhaps the most heartbreaking detail Sarah revealed was Tommy's desperate attempts to avoid punishment by concealing evidence of his normal bodily functions. Her account of Tommy consuming his own waste to hide it from his abusers represented a level of terror and desperation that defied comprehension. This detail revealed not just the physical abuse Tommy endured, but the psychological torture that had driven him to such extreme measures to try to protect himself from further violence. The fact that Tommy's attempts at self-protection were discovered and used as justification for additional abuse showed the impossible situation he had been placed in. No matter what he did, whether he followed the impossible rules set for him or tried to protect himself from punishment, he faced escalating violence from the adults who controlled every aspect of his life. David's admissions during his interrogation were becoming increasingly damaging as investigators pressed him for more details about his treatment of Tommy. His casual acknowledgement of using caustic substances as punishment revealed a level of premeditated cruelty that went far beyond momentary loss of control. His description of applying hot sauce to Tommy's genital area as a form of discipline was so disturbing that even experienced investigators struggled to maintain their professional composure. David's attempt to justify this torture by comparing it to his own childhood experiences reflected a cycle of abuse that had been passed down through generations. But what made his actions even more disturbing was his clinical assessment of the results. His observation that the caustic substances had destroyed Tommy's skin showed that he had been monitoring the physical damage he was inflicting while continuing to escalate the abuse. The investigators' decision to obtain DNA evidence from David reflected their understanding that they were dealing with evidence of serious sexual abuse, in addition to the physical torture that had been documented. David's awareness that this evidence was being collected, and his immediate questions about what the other adults in the house were telling investigators suggested that he understood the full scope of the crimes he was being investigated for. David's changing accounts of the weapons he had used to beat Tommy revealed the systematic nature of the violence and his awareness that these details were incriminating. His initial claims that he had only used his hands to discipline Tommy were quickly abandoned when confronted with physical evidence and witness testimony. His admission that he had used kitchen implements to beat Tommy showed that the abuse had involved the deliberate selection and use of weapons designed to inflict maximum pain and damage. The injuries that investigators documented on Tommy's body told the story of sustained, systematic torture that had been inflicted over an extended period. David's attempts to characterize these injuries as rashes from poor hygiene were contradicted by medical evidence that clearly showed the patterns of deliberate trauma. His suggestion that Tommy's injuries could have been caused by being dragged revealed his continued attempts to minimize his actions even as the evidence mounted against him. The revelation of David's previous child endangering charges added context to the current case and suggested a pattern of neglect and poor judgment that had been escalating over time. His attempt to minimize these previous incidents as minor oversights was contradicted by the serious nature of the charges and the pattern of behavior they revealed. But it was David's description of Tommy's condition during his final, the bathtub experience that provided the most chilling insight into the boy's final hours. His account of Tommy exhibiting what appeared to be seizure-like activity, combined with his dismissive characterization of these symptoms as putting on a show, revealed the complete dehumanization that had allowed such systematic abuse to continue. David's suggestion that Tommy was capable of faking seizures and other serious medical symptoms showed how thoroughly he had convinced himself that his victim was somehow responsible for the abuse being inflicted upon him. This level of psychological distortion was common among perpetrators of severe child abuse, but rarely documented with such clarity in their own words. The medical reality was that Tommy's condition during those final hours was almost certainly the result of severe internal injuries, neurological damage, or systemic trauma from the accumulated abuse he had suffered. David's interpretation of these symptoms as manipulative behavior rather than medical emergency reflected his complete inability to recognize Tommy's humanity or his own responsibility for the boy's suffering. As investigators pieced together the various accounts and physical evidence, they realized they were dealing with a case that went far beyond typical domestic violence or child abuse. The systematic nature of Tommy's torture, the coordination among the adults in concealing and enabling it, and the deliberate isolation tactics used to prevent outside intervention suggested a level of premeditation and organization that was deeply disturbing. The pattern of behavior that emerged showed that Tommy's abuse had been carefully managed and controlled by adults who understood the legal and social consequences of their actions, but had chosen to continue anyway. Their efforts to manipulate outside authorities, control the narrative around Tommy's condition, and eliminate potential witnesses or advocates revealed a sophisticated understanding of how to maintain their abuse while avoiding detection. The question that haunted investigators was how this level of systematic torture could have continued for so long in a suburban neighborhood where neighbors, teachers, social workers, and law enforcement had all had contact with Tommy and his family. The answer lay in the calculated deception of the perpetrators, the failure of multiple systems designed to protect children, and the tragic reality that Tommy had been so effectively isolated that his cries for help had gone unheard until it was too late. As the interrogations continued, investigators knew they were racing against time to build a case that would hold all responsible parties accountable for their roles in Tommy's death. But they also knew that the evidence they were uncovering would haunt them long after the case was closed, serving as a reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the urgent need for better systems to protect vulnerable children. The truth about Tommy's final day was emerging piece by piece, but with each new revelation came the understanding that his death had been not just predictable, but inevitable given the escalating torture he had endured. The adults who should have protected him had instead orchestrated his destruction, and their attempts to cover their tracks only served to highlight the calculated nature of their crimes. What investigators still needed to understand was the full extent of the coordination among the perpetrators and whether there was evidence of additional crimes that had not yet been discovered. The systematic nature of Tommy's abuse suggested that the adults involved had been operating with a level of organization and planning that might extend beyond this single case. As they prepared to confront the suspects with the mounting evidence against them, investigators knew they were dealing with individuals who had demonstrated a capacity for deception and manipulation that would make obtaining full confessions challenging. But the physical evidence, the witness testimony, and the contradictions in the suspect's own statements were building an overwhelming case that would demand justice for Tommy Collins, even if it could never undo the suffering he had endured. As the investigation reached its climactic phase, investigators found themselves confronting the final, most damning pieces of evidence that would expose the full scope of the conspiracy that had led to Tommy Collins' death. What they discovered in these final hours would not only seal the fate of those responsible, but would also reveal the systematic nature of a torture operation that had been carefully orchestrated and maintained for years. David's continued deflection and self-focus during his interrogation reached disturbing new levels as investigators pressed him for final details about Tommy's treatment. His attempts to characterize Tommy's obvious medical distress as putting on a show revealed a level of psychological detachment that was almost as chilling as the physical abuse itself. His casual mention that he could command Tommy to stop exhibiting symptoms of what appeared to be seizures, and that Tommy would comply out of terror, demonstrated the complete psychological control he had exercised over his victim. The image of a 10-year-old boy, possibly suffering from neurological damage or severe internal injuries, being told to stop showing symptoms of distress and immediately complying out of fear, painted a picture of psychological torture that accompanied the physical abuse. Tommy had been so thoroughly terrorized that even while experiencing what may have been life-threatening medical episodes, his primary concern was avoiding further punishment from his abuser. David's focus on his own future rather than grief for his son's death was perhaps the most revealing aspect of his psychological profile. His immediate concern about spending the rest of my life in prison and his calculations about Ohio's death penalty laws showed that even in the moments after being confronted with evidence of his son's death, his primary consideration was self-preservation rather than remorse or accountability. His attempt to frame his actions as legitimate parenting that had somehow gone wrong, claiming he was trying to raise my child the right way, reflected a complete inability to acknowledge the systematic nature of the torture he had inflicted. His characterization of Tommy as having become defiant suggested that he genuinely believed his escalating abuse was a reasonable response to normal childhood behavior. But it was Sarah's final revelations that would provide the most damning evidence against David and expose torture methods that investigators had not yet uncovered. When asked about other forms of abuse she had witnessed, Sarah revealed that David had regularly strangled Tommy, describing scenes where David would pin the boy down with his knees on Tommy's chest, while choking him with his hands around the child's throat. This revelation about strangulation added a new dimension to the charges investigators were building against David. Strangulation is often considered one of the most serious forms of domestic violence because of its high correlation with eventual homicide. The fact that David had been regularly choking a 10-year-old child showed that Tommy's death was not an unexpected outcome, but rather the inevitable result of escalating violence that had been progressing toward lethality. The discovery of a dog leash hanging from a screw above the living room couch added another disturbing element to the evidence against David. When questioned about this item, David's explanations were inconsistent and suspicious. Initially, he claimed it was used to hang a punching bag for his younger brother's exercise, but Sarah's account suggested a different use entirely. The positioning of the leash and the screw mounting suggested it had been installed for purposes that were far more sinister than recreational exercise equipment. Tommy's autopsy would later reveal injuries consistent with ligature strangulation, lending credibility to concerns that the dog leash had been used as an instrument of torture. The fact that David had prepared explanations for this item before being questioned about it suggested advanced planning and awareness that its true purpose would be seen as incriminating. As David's interrogation concluded, his final pleas revealed the depth of his narcissism and his complete inability to understand the gravity of what he had done. His repeated requests for leniency, his claims that he was only 30 and had his whole life ahead of him, showed no recognition that Tommy had been only 10 years old when his life was violently ended. David's self-pity in the face of overwhelming evidence of his crimes against a child was perhaps the most damning evidence of his character. The dynamics within the household were further revealed when investigators discovered that Sarah had been systematically isolated and controlled by David and Lisa. Her revelation that she was not allowed to have a phone or internet access, and that she had been told this was because she told too many secrets and couldn't keep her mouth shut, exposed the level of control that had been exercised over potential witnesses to Tommy's abuse. This detail was significant because it showed that David and Lisa were aware that Sarah might report what she witnessed if given the opportunity to communicate with the outside world. Their decision to cut off her access to communication channels demonstrated their consciousness of guilt and their understanding that what they were doing to Tommy was criminal. The fact that Sarah had been living in the house throughout the period of Tommy's abuse, witnessing daily torture but unable to report it because of her isolation and dependence on Lisa for housing and support, added another tragic dimension to the case. She had been essentially imprisoned alongside Tommy, forced to watch his suffering while being threatened with consequences if she spoke out. When David was finally arrested and charged with murder and child endangering, his reaction continued to focus on himself rather than the victim. His questions about the legal definitions of murder and his concerns about whether the charges implied premeditation showed that even in custody, his primary concern was minimizing his legal exposure rather than accepting responsibility for Tommy's death. The overheard comments David made while at the hospital for medical evaluation provided perhaps the most incriminating evidence of his consciousness of guilt. His repeated statements that Tommy must have drowned because I did not beat his ass that bad today revealed both his awareness that he had beaten Tommy severely and his desperate attempts to construct alternative explanations for the boy's death. These spontaneous utterances, made when David believed he was unobserved, contradicted his carefully constructed narrative about Tommy's self-inflicted injuries and accidental death. They showed that David knew his actions had caused Tommy's death and was already trying to develop a defense strategy based on minimizing the severity of the final assault. The task of informing Tommy's biological mother, Rachel, about her son's death was one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the investigation. Rachel's immediate understanding that David had beat my son to death reflected her long-standing fears about Tommy's safety and her desperate but unsuccessful attempts to protect him from a distance. Rachel's account of David's previous threats added crucial context to the case. Her description of David telling her he would kill Tommy, his statements about beating the boy because of perceived sexual orientation, and his promises that she would never see him again, painted a picture of a man who had been planning to permanently separate Tommy from anyone who might advocate for him or monitor his welfare. Perhaps most tragically, Rachel revealed that she had repeatedly contacted social services with warnings that David was going to kill Tommy. Her predictions about the isolation tactics David would use removing Tommy from school and separating him from people who cared about him had proven accurate. Her final prediction that it was only a matter of time before he killed my son had come true despite her efforts to prevent it. Rachel's anguish and her threats of vigilante justice if the legal system failed to hold David accountable reflected the frustration of a mother who had tried every official channel to protect her child and had been failed by the very systems designed to prevent such tragedies. The recorded jail calls between David and Lisa provided investigators with valuable insight into their relationship and their coordinated efforts to manipulate the legal proceedings. Their conversations revealed that even after arrest, they were working together to control the narrative and minimize their respective culpability. David's instructions to Lisa to stick to the story and his positioning of her as his witness showed that they had coordinated their accounts well before being questioned by police. Their confidence that Tommy would have spoken for David if he were alive revealed their belief that they had successfully convinced Tommy that his abuse was normal or deserved. Lisa's promises to be there for David, despite overwhelming evidence of his crimes against Tommy showed that her primary loyalty was to her relationship rather than to justice for the murdered child. Her willingness to continue supporting David, even after learning the full extent of Tommy's suffering, demonstrated a level of moral corruption that was almost as disturbing as David's direct violence. The couple's discussions about Sarah revealed their awareness that she posed a threat to their defense strategy. Their attempts to characterize her as mentally unstable and unreliable showed that they understood her testimony would be damaging and were already working to discredit her credibility. David's instructions to Lisa to inform somebody of that girl's mental condition, and their predictions that Sarah wouldn't be able to handle testifying, revealed their strategy of using Sarah's cognitive limitations against her. Their coded references to Sarah as a dog that needed to be tamed or made to stop barking showed their continued efforts to control and silence her even from jail. These conversations provided clear evidence of ongoing conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The fact that David and Lisa felt comfortable discussing these strategies over recorded jail lines showed their confidence that they could manipulate the system even after being caught. The investigation into Tommy Cohen's death had revealed far more than a single incident of child abuse that had resulted in death. What investigators had uncovered was a systematic campaign of torture that had been carefully planned, executed, and concealed by multiple adults over an extended period. The evidence showed premeditation, coordination, and a level of cruelty that challenged the investigators' understanding of human nature. The failure of multiple systems to protect Tommy, despite numerous warnings and reports, represented a catastrophic breakdown in child protection that had cost an innocent life. Teachers, social workers, law enforcement officers, and family members had all had opportunities to intervene, but the combination of systemic failures, manipulative abusers, and bureaucratic obstacles had allowed Tommy's torture to continue until it reached its inevitable conclusion. As the case moved toward prosecution, investigators knew they had built an overwhelming case against all three adults who had played roles in Tommy's death. The physical evidence, witness testimony, recorded admissions, and documented history of abuse created a comprehensive picture of guilt that would be difficult for any defense attorney to challenge. But they also knew that no amount of justice could undo the suffering Tommy had endured or restore the childhood that had been stolen from him. The boy who should have been playing with friends, attending school, and experiencing the joy and security of a loving family had instead spent his final years in a hell of systematic torture, isolation, and terror. The case of Tommy Combs would serve as a stark reminder of the vulnerability of children and the urgent need for better systems to protect them from those who would do them harm. It would also stand as testament to the importance of believing children when they cry for help and taking seriously the warnings of those who advocate for their welfare. As David Miller, Lisa Henderson, and Sarah Walsh faced the consequences of their actions, the memory of Tommy Collins would live on as a symbol of innocence destroyed and a call to action for all those charged with protecting society's most vulnerable members. His death had not been in vain if it served to prevent similar tragedies and inspired better protections for other children who might be suffering in silence. The investigation was complete, the arrests had been made, and justice was beginning its slow but inexorable process. But for those who had worked the case, the image of a 10-year-old boy calling out, "Dad, help," and his final moments would remain a haunting reminder of the price of societal failure and the urgent need to do better in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. As the legal machinery began to grind forward in the case against Tommy Collins' killers, investigators discovered that the conspiracy to conceal his murder was far from over. Even from behind bars, the perpetrators were continuing their coordinated efforts to manipulate witnesses, control narratives, and escape accountability for their crimes. What emerged was a chilling demonstration of how calculating these individuals had been, not just in orchestrating Tommy's torture, but in their sophisticated attempts to avoid consequences. The recorded jail conversations between David and Lisa revealed the depth of their coordination and their continued efforts to obstruct justice even after arrest. Their coded language about Sarah being a dog that needed to be tamed and made to stop barking showed that they viewed her not as a traumatized witness to horrific crimes, but as a problem to be managed and controlled. Their casual discussion of making sure that dog knows it's very important that Daddy stay quiet demonstrated their ongoing attempts to intimidate and silence the one person who could provide the most damaging testimony against them. The effectiveness of their intimidation campaign became apparent when Sarah returned to speak with police just days after her initial devastating testimony. The woman who had broken down while describing Tommy's systematic torture was now attempting to recant much of what she had revealed. Her sudden claim that David didn't abuse him but merely disciplined him represented such a dramatic reversal that investigators immediately recognized the signs of witness manipulation. Sarah's new narrative that David had only used a spatula to spank his hands and his butt was so dramatically different from her previous accounts of strangulation, electric shock torture, and systematic beatings that it was obviously the result of external pressure rather than recovered memory or clarification. Her attempts to minimize the severity of what she had witnessed were textbook examples of a vulnerable witness being coached and threatened by more powerful individuals. The investigators' direct confrontation of this manipulation revealed their understanding of the psychological dynamics at play. Their blunt assessment that Amanda is manipulating you, and their reference to the recorded jail calls where Sarah was referred to as a dog that needed to be silenced showed that they were well aware of the ongoing conspiracy to obstruct justice. The revelation that investigators had been monitoring the jail calls between David and Lisa added a new dimension to the evidence against them. Their recorded discussions about Sarah needing to shut up, and their threats that if that dog talks, that dog's going to get pounded, provided clear evidence of witness, intimidation, and ongoing criminal conspiracy. These conversations showed that even after being charged with murder, David and Lisa were continuing to commit crimes in their efforts to escape accountability. The investigators appealed to Sarah's humanity, pointing out that she was lying for two. Individuals that physically abused a child for years reflected their understanding that she was as much a victim of David and Lisa's manipulation as she was a witness to Tommy's abuse. Their recognition that Lisa probably still mentally abuses you showed their awareness of the psychological control that had been exercised over Sarah throughout her time in that household. But it was the revelation of Tommy's autopsy results that provided the most definitive evidence of the systematic torture he had endured. The medical examiner's findings were so horrific that they challenged investigators' ability to process the level of cruelty that had been inflicted upon a 10-year-old child over an extended period. David and Lisa's attempts to control the narrative around Tommy's cause of death were revealed in their continued jail conversations. Lisa's claim that the autopsy showed cardiac arrest and her citation of statistics about heart failure in children represented a desperate attempt to characterize Tommy's death as a medical anomaly rather than the result of sustained torture. Her assertion that heart failure happens to over 2,000 kids a year between the ages of 10 and 19 inches was not only factually incorrect, but revealed her continued efforts to minimize the role of their actions in Tommy's death. The reality documented by the medical examiner painted a picture of suffering that was almost impossible to comprehend. Tommy's body bore evidence of hundreds of injuries, both healed and fresh, covering virtually every part of his small frame. The systematic nature of these injuries, their locations, and their varying stages of healing told the story of sustained, calculated torture that had been inflicted over months or years. The injuries to Tommy's head, face, mouth, neck, chest, abdomen, back, buttocks, arms, hands, legs, and feet showed that no part of his body had been spared from violence. The fact that many of these injuries were in defensive locations suggested that Tommy had repeatedly tried to protect himself from the attacks, only to have his defensive gestures overcome by superior size and strength. The deep bruising observed throughout Tommy's body, particularly the bruising to his buttocks that extended all the way to the bone, provided evidence of beating so severe that it had caused damage to the deepest layers of tissue. This level of trauma required significant force applied repeatedly over time, contradicting any claims that Tommy's injuries were the result of minor discipline or accidents. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of what appeared to be deliberate branding on Tommy's back four letters beginning with T that had been burned or carved into his skin. This evidence of intentional marking suggested a level of sadistic cruelty that went beyond even the systematic beatings and torture. It showed that Tommy had been literally branded like an animal, marked as property by his abusers in a way that demonstrated their complete dehumanization of him. The severe bruising to the back of Tommy's neck, described as extending through all layers of neck muscle directly over the spine, provided medical evidence that corroborated Sarah's testimony about strangulation. The medical examiner's observation that this type of injury was typically only seen in catastrophic events such as a severe car accident showed that the force applied to Tommy's neck had been sufficient to cause life-threatening trauma. The official cause of death, multiple blunt force trauma in combination with compressive asphyxia and water submersion, told the complete story of Tommy's final moments. He had been beaten severely enough to cause multiple traumatic injuries, strangled to the point of asphyxiation, and then subjected to drowning or near drowning. The combination of these three mechanisms of injury showed that his death had not been the result of a single violent incident, but rather the culmination of multiple forms of assault occurring in sequence or simultaneously. When Sarah was interviewed for the third time, her willingness to provide additional details about Tommy's torture revealed the ongoing struggle between her desire to tell the truth and the pressure she was receiving to protect David and Lisa. Her description of the surveillance system and its true purpose added yet another dimension to the systematic nature of Tommy's imprisonment. The revelation that Tommy had been forced to maintain stress positions for up to 20 hours at a time exposed a form of torture that was typically associated with military interrogation or prisoner abuse, rather than any legitimate form of child discipline. Sarah's demonstration of these positions, standing with legs crossed and hands behind his head or back, or bent over with hands spread, showed that Tommy had been subjected to techniques designed to cause maximum physical discomfort and psychological degradation. The requirement that Tommy maintain these positions from 7 in the morning until 3 or 4 the following morning represented a form of torture that was both physically and psychologically devastating. The constant surveillance to ensure compliance meant that Tommy had been denied not only physical comfort, but also mental respite from his torment. He had been forced to remain alert and compliant for nearly 24 hours at a time, under constant observation, knowing that any deviation from the required positions would result in additional punishment. Sarah's explanation that these positions were supposedly designed to make him start listening and stop going to the bathroom on himself revealed the twisted logic that David had used to justify this torture. The idea that forcing a child to stand in stress positions for 20 hours would somehow improve his behavior or bladder control showed the complete disconnect from reality that had characterized David's approach to parenting. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Sarah's testimony was her claim that Tommy had told her he liked getting in trouble and liked getting his beatings. This assertion, if true, would represent the final psychological victory of Tommy's abusers, convincing their victim that he was somehow responsible for or even enjoyed the torture being inflicted upon him. However, the context of this claim raised serious questions about its accuracy. Sarah was clearly under tremendous pressure to minimize the severity of Tommy's abuse and to shift blame away from David and Lisa. Her assertion that Tommy had repeatedly told her he enjoyed being beaten was so inconsistent with normal human psychology and with her previous testimony that it appeared to be another example of coached testimony designed to support a defense strategy. The psychological reality was that children subjected to severe abuse often develop coping mechanisms that include self-blame and attempts to rationalize their treatment. A child who has been convinced that he deserves punishment, or who has learned that claiming to enjoy it might reduce its severity, might indeed make statements that seem to support his abuser's narrative. But such statements would be the result of psychological conditioning and trauma rather than genuine preference. The arrests of Lisa and Sarah for child endangerment marked a significant escalation in the legal proceedings, but they also revealed the continued efforts by the perpetrators to maintain their conspiracy even from behind bars. Lisa's elaborate scheme to communicate with David through her mother showed the lengths to which they were willing to go to coordinate their defense strategies and continue their obstruction of justice. The assistant Lisa devised sending messages to her mother to pass to David, then receiving his responses through the same intermediary demonstrated both the sophistication of their deception and their continued belief that they could manipulate the system to their advantage. The fact that they were able to maintain this illegal communication for months before being discovered showed how determined they were to control the narrative around Tommy's death. Lisa's mother's willingness to facilitate this illegal communication raised serious questions about the family dynamics that had enabled Tommy's abuse to continue for so long. The fact that even after learning about the systematic torture of a 10-year-old child, Lisa's mother was willing to help her daughter obstruct justice, suggested that the values and priorities that had allowed Tommy's suffering to continue were shared by a broader network of individuals. The recorded conversation between David and his friend provided insight into how the case was being perceived within the criminal justice system and among those familiar with it. The friend's blunt assessment that David was going straight to Madison and would be labeled a sex offender for the rest of your life reflected the reality that crimes against children, particularly those involving torture and sexual abuse, carried both legal and social consequences that extended far beyond formal sentencing. The friend's warning about what David could expect in prison, that everywhere I go he going to try to kill me, reflected the reality that individuals convicted of crimes against children face particular dangers within the correctional system. The prison hierarchy, even among convicted criminals, placed child abusers at the bottom, making them targets for violence from other inmates. Perhaps most significantly, the friend's observation that Lisa and Sarah had turned against David and were preparing to be co-defendants against you showed that the conspiracy that had protected Tommy's abusers was finally breaking down. The recognition that they terrified of you suggested that the control David had exercised over the women in his household was based on fear and intimidation rather than loyalty or affection. The friend's assessment that David's chances of beating the case were minimal. "It's not looking like you're going to," reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence that had been assembled against him. The physical evidence, witness testimony, recorded admissions, and medical findings had created a case that would be extremely difficult for any defense attorney to challenge successfully. The revelation that Sarah had entered into a plea agreement marked a crucial turning point in the case. Her decision to cooperate with prosecutors rather than maintain her loyalty to David and Lisa showed that the intimidation and manipulation tactics that had been used to control her were finally losing their effectiveness. Lisa's reaction to news of Sarah's plea deal, her complaint that prosecutors were trying to portray her role as higher than Jenny's, revealed her continued efforts to minimize her culpability and shift blame to others. Her assertion that it was ridiculous for her to be held more responsible than Sarah, given that Sarah was home all the time, showed that she still failed to understand that physical presence during abuse created an obligation to intervene and protect the victim. The complexity of the plea negotiations and the attempts by various defendants to minimize their roles while maximizing others' culpability reflected the challenge prosecutors faced in holding all responsible parties accountable for their roles in Tommy's death. The evidence showed that while David had been the primary perpetrator of physical violence, both Lisa and Sarah had played crucial roles in enabling and concealing the abuse. Lisa's mother's statement to investigators that Sarah will not testify against him because she loves David revealed another layer of the psychological manipulation that had characterized the household dynamics. The idea that love could be used to justify silence in the face of child torture showed how thoroughly the normal concepts of love, loyalty, and family obligation had been perverted by David's influence. As the case moved toward trial, investigators and prosecutors knew they had built an overwhelming case against all three defendants. The physical evidence, medical findings, witness testimony, recorded conversations, and demonstrated pattern of abuse created a comprehensive picture of guilt that would be difficult for any defense team to overcome. But they also knew that the legal proceedings would force them to relive and present in detail the suffering that Tommy had endured during his short life. The task of seeking justice for this 10-year-old victim would require prosecutors to document and present evidence of torture so severe that it would challenge jurors' ability to process and understand the depths of human cruelty. The case of Tommy Collins had already exposed the failure of multiple systems designed to protect children and the sophisticated methods used by abusers to evade detection and accountability. As it moved toward its legal conclusion, it would serve as a test of society's commitment to holding perpetrators of child torture accountable, and its ability to deliver meaningful justice for the most vulnerable victims. The conspiracy that had enabled Tommy's torture was finally unraveling, but the damage it had caused could never be undone. A 10-year-old boy who should have been protected, nurtured, and loved had instead been systematically destroyed by the very adults who should have been his guardians and protectors. No amount of legal accountability could restore his life or undo his suffering, but the pursuit of justice remained the only way to honor his memory and send a clear message that such crimes against children would not be tolerated. As the legal proceedings continued, the memory of Tommy Collins would serve as a constant reminder of the urgent need for better systems to protect vulnerable children and the importance of believing and acting upon the warnings of those who try to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. In the final months before trial, the carefully constructed conspiracy that had enabled Tommy Collins' torture began to completely collapse. The bonds of loyalty and manipulation that had held the perpetrators together for so long finally shattered under the weight of overwhelming evidence and the reality of spending decades behind bars for their crimes. The transformation in Lisa's attitude toward David represented one of the most dramatic reversals in a case already filled with shocking developments. The woman who had promised to stand by him no matter what, and had coordinated elaborate schemes to maintain illegal communication from jail, was finally beginning to see the man she had protected for what he truly was. Her mother's blunt assessment that Lisa needed to wake up and that there were things about David she may not know suggested that even those closest to Lisa had understood what she had been blind to for years. The revelation that David's relationship with Lisa had been a lot more one way than she had realized spoke to the fundamental power imbalance that had characterized not just his relationship with Tommy, but his control over all the vulnerable people in his sphere. Lisa was beginning to understand that she had not been David's partner in a relationship, but rather another victim of his manipulation and control, albeit one who had been complicit in the destruction of an innocent child. Lisa's growing awareness of her situation was reflected in her desperate attempts to negotiate a plea deal with prosecutors. Her recorded conversations revealed a woman who was finally grappling with the reality that her loyalty to David had cost her not only her freedom, but also her moral standing. Her complaints that they don't want to offer me a deal showed that she was beginning to understand that her level of culpability might be greater than she had previously acknowledged. The prosecutor's apparent reluctance to offer Lisa a favorable plea agreement reflected the strength of the evidence against her and the severity of her role in Tommy's death. Unlike Sarah, whose cognitive limitations and obvious manipulation by the other adults made her a more sympathetic figure, Lisa had been an educated adult woman who had made conscious choices to enable and conceal Tommy's torture. Her attempts to present herself as another victim of David's abuse were undermined by evidence of her active participation in maintaining the conspiracy and her failure to protect a child who was being systematically destroyed under her own roof. Lisa's related claims about being threatened by David whenever she tried to leave the relationship rang hollow when weighed against her documented behavior throughout the investigation. Her initial fierce loyalty to David, her coordination of witness intimidation efforts, and her elaborate schemes to maintain illegal communication showed that her participation in the conspiracy had been active and willing rather than coerced. The irony of Lisa's situation was that her very efforts to protect David had created evidence of her own guilt. The recorded jail calls, the witness intimidation, the attempts to coordinate false testimony, all of these actions had demonstrated a level of consciousness of guilt and active participation that made her claims of victimization less credible. The collapse of the conspiracy was further evidenced by the different sentences ultimately received by each defendant. The stark differences in their punishments reflected both the varying degrees of their culpability and their willingness to accept responsibility for their actions. Sarah's sentence of 8 years in prison, while still substantial for someone with her cognitive limitations, reflected the prosecutor's understanding of her unique position in the household hierarchy. Her cooperation with investigators, her obvious distress when describing Tommy's suffering, and the evidence that she herself had been controlled and manipulated by the other adults all contributed to a more lenient outcome. The court recognized that while Sarah had failed in her obligation to protect Tommy, she had been operating under constraints and threats that limited her ability to act independently. Sarah's willingness to testify truthfully about what she had witnessed, despite the obvious pressure she faced to remain silent, ultimately served as a crucial factor in building the cases against the other defendants. Her decision to break her silence and tell the truth about Tommy's systematic torture required considerable courage, given her dependence on Lisa and her vulnerability to retaliation. Lisa's sentence of 22 years to life represented the court's assessment that she bore significant responsibility for Tommy's death despite not being the primary perpetrator of physical violence. Her conviction for involuntary manslaughter rather than murder reflected the prosecution's recognition that while she had enabled and concealed Tommy's abuse, she had not directly inflicted the fatal injuries. However, the length of Lisa's sentence ensuring she would remain behind bars until at least 2041 reflected the severity of her role in the conspiracy and her failure to protect a child whose suffering was obvious and prolonged. The court's decision meant that Lisa would serve over 2 decades in prison for her role in enabling Tommy's torture, acknowledging that her inaction and complicity had been nearly as destructive as David's direct violence. Lisa's appeal of her sentence demonstrated her continued unwillingness to fully accept responsibility for her actions. Even after pleading guilty and being sentenced, she maintained that her punishment was somehow excessive or unjustified. This ongoing denial reflected the psychological mechanisms that had allowed her to rationalize her behavior throughout Tommy's torture and suggested that she still failed to fully grasp the magnitude of what she had enabled. David's sentence of 51 years to life represented the court's recognition that he had been the primary architect and perpetrator of Tommy's systematic torture. His convictions for murder, kidnapping, rape, and child endangerment reflected the full scope of his crimes against a defenseless child who had been placed in his care. The kidnapping charge acknowledged that Tommy had been held against his will, imprisoned in conditions that no reasonable person would consider appropriate for any human being, let alone a child. The systematic isolation, the locked doors, the surveillance, and the denial of basic human needs had constituted a form of imprisonment that went far beyond any legitimate exercise of parental authority. The rape conviction reflected the sexual nature of some of the abuse Tommy had endured, adding another dimension of horror to an already unconscionable case. The evidence of sexual abuse, combined with the systematic physical torture and psychological manipulation, painted a picture of comprehensive victimization that had denied Tommy not just his safety and dignity, but his very humanity. The murder conviction represented the court's finding that David's actions had been the direct and proximate cause of Tommy's death. While the defense might have argued that Tommy's death was the result of accumulated abuse rather than a single fatal incident, the evidence showed that David's systematic torture had created the conditions that made Tommy's death inevitable. David's sentence ensured that he would likely spend the rest of his natural life in prison, acknowledging that his crimes against Tommy represented such a fundamental violation of the social contract that he could never be safely returned to society. The court's decision reflected not just punishment for past actions, but recognition that someone capable of such systematic cruelty against a defenseless child posed an ongoing danger that required permanent incapacitation. The disparate sentences received by the three defendants also reflected the importance of cooperation and acceptance of responsibility in the criminal justice system. Sarah's willingness to testify truthfully, despite enormous pressure to remain silent, had been rewarded with a more lenient sentence that acknowledged her unique circumstances. Lisa's eventual cooperation, coming only after her initial denials had been thoroughly discredited, received less consideration. David's complete failure to accept responsibility or show genuine remorse for his actions contributed to the severity of his punishment. But beyond the individual sentences and their legal significance, the case of Tommy Collins represented something much larger and more troubling about the systems designed to protect vulnerable children. The multiple opportunities for intervention that had been missed, the warning signs that had been ignored, and the reports that had been inadequately investigated all pointed to systemic failures that had enabled Tommy's torture to continue until it reached its inevitable conclusion. The fact that Tommy's biological mother had explicitly warned authorities that David was going to kill her son, and that this prediction had come true despite her efforts to prevent it, represented a catastrophic failure of the child protection system. Rachel's desperate calls for help, her detailed descriptions of the abuse, and her accurate predictions about David's isolation tactics should have triggered immediate and effective intervention. The school's multiple reports about Tommy's condition, their observations of his obvious distress and physical deterioration, and their repeated attempts to provide him with basic care and dignity should have resulted in more aggressive investigation and action. The fact that David was able to simply withdraw Tommy from school when the scrutiny became too intense showed that the system lacked the tools or authority needed to protect children from determined abusers. The police's cursory responses to welfare checks, their failure to speak privately with Tommy, despite explicit requests from his mother, and their acceptance of David's explanations without thorough investigation represented missed opportunities that might have saved Tommy's life. The pattern of superficial investigation and quick closure of concerning reports suggested that the system was designed more for bureaucratic efficiency than for effective child protection. The case also highlighted the sophisticated methods used by modern child abusers to evade detection and accountability. David's use of surveillance technology, his manipulation of medical and educational systems, his control of information and communication, and his systematic isolation of his victim represented a level of calculated planning that challenged traditional approaches to child protection. The psychological manipulation that had been used to control not just Tommy, but also the adult witnesses in the household showed how abusers could create environments where victims and potential advocates were too frightened or psychologically compromised to seek help effectively. The intimidation tactics, the threats of consequences for disclosure, and the creation of dependency relationships had effectively silenced those who might have spoken for Tommy. Perhaps most tragically, the case demonstrated how a child could be systematically destroyed while living in plain sight of a community that had multiple opportunities to intervene. Tommy had attended school, lived in a neighborhood, and been seen by numerous professionals and community members, yet his suffering had continued until it killed him. The legacy of Tommy Collins must be more than just the punishment of those who destroyed him. His death serves as a call to action for everyone involved in child protection, from teachers and social workers to law enforcement officers and ordinary community members, to be more vigilant, more persistent, and more willing to act when children appear to be in danger. Tommy's story reminds us that behind every statistic about child abuse is a real child whose suffering is immediate and whose need for protection is urgent. His case shows that the systems designed to protect children must be strengthened, better funded, and held accountable for their effectiveness in identifying and responding to abuse. For the investigators, prosecutors, and others who worked on Tommy's case, his memory serves as both inspiration and burden. Their dedication to seeking justice for him ensured that his killers would be held accountable, but it could not undo the suffering he had endured or restore the childhood that had been stolen from him. In the end, Tommy Collins was just 10 years old when his life was ended by the very people who should have cherished and protected him. He should have been learning to ride a bike, playing with friends, discovering his interests and talents, and experiencing the joy and security that every child deserves. Instead, he spent his final years in a hell of systematic torture, isolation, and terror that challenges our understanding of human cruelty. His story is not just about the evil that humans can inflict upon the innocent, but also about the urgent responsibility we all share to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Tommy's voice was silenced by his killers, but his story continues to speak, demanding that we do better, that we listen more carefully, and that we act more decisively when children cry out for help. The case is closed, the sentences have been served, and justice has been rendered according to law. But the real measure of justice for Tommy Collins will be found in whether his story inspires changes that protect other children from similar fates. His memory deserves nothing less than our unwavering commitment to ensuring that no other child suffers as he did, alone and unprotected in a world that should have kept him safe. Tommy Collins deserved so much more than the life he was given. He deserved love, safety, education, play, and the chance to grow up and discover his potential. Those things can never be restored to him, but we can honor his memory by working to ensure that other children receive the protection and care that he was denied. In that ongoing work, Tommy's story becomes not just a tragedy to be mourned, but a catalyst for the changes needed to prevent future tragedies. His short life ended in darkness, but the light of justice that followed, and the awareness his story has created, may yet serve to protect other children who cannot speak for themselves. That is the only redemption possible in a case where innocence was destroyed by those who should have treasured it. And it is the responsibility that all of us who know his story must carry forward.